Slaying hundreds of monsters in sprawling areas is one staple of action role-playing games and MMOs, but so is battling a boss one-on-one or facing a gauntlet of numerous powerful creatures all at the same time. Both Diablo 4 and my personal favorite ARPG, Path of Exile, contain these epic boss fights, although I'd argue PoE wins out in almost every area of bossing, or the act of chasing and defeating bosses. It dominates Diablo 4 in the sphere of progression, which we'll explore in full momentarily. First, let's overview what bossing is like in Diablo 4. Then, we'll delve into PoE, why I think it's superior, as well as similarities and differences between the two games. All you D4 players out there, I know your potential exiles. I'm going to do my best to lure you in and capture your soul on the dark shores of Rayclast and this lovely little game we call Path of Exile. Don't be intimidated, come wreck some PoE bosses, let's go! I've played a bit of Diablo 4, enough to fight every base boss in the game except the latest one introduced in Season of the Malignant. Unfortunately, only 2 bosses in the game are truly compelling presently. Astaroth, who is the second act boss, and Lilith, the final boss in the campaign and the uber level 100 aspirational boss of Diablo 4. Across the ARPG, the boss design is quite standard, especially when it comes to dungeon bosses. The only truly interesting ones are found in the Axe, a single unique endgame only boss guarding the path to the 3rd difficulty mode, and some tougher echoes, which you fight to ascend through the next world tier, or finish the game in the case of Uber Lilith. Already, this is a problem for those who enjoy bossing. There are too few interesting pinnacle boss challenges in the game. Far too few. However, that's not the biggest Diablo 4 boss problem, potential exiles. Most of the boss fights aren't compelling, and the few that are do not reward you for completing them. Right now, you are rewarded for fighting these pinnacle bosses by progressing to the next world tier, or, in the case of Uber Lilith, an achievement and chance at a mount skin. That's all. Seriously. Some PoE players listening might be puzzled, but you've heard me correctly. Bosses, even pinnacle bosses in Diablo 4, do not have unique items or specific loot tables attached to them. It's a deliberate decision, likely a result of access to Diablo 4's pinnacle bosses. It's infinite, unlike PoE, and merely has a character level requirement attached to it. So that's all in D4. You progress through act bosses, a series of pinnacle tier bosses that are mostly reused act bosses, plenty of nightmare bosses who are the same as normal dungeon bosses, and then, eventually, when you hit level 100, you can attempt to down Uber Lilith as the final pinnacle boss, which is a massive challenge for most players, as almost all her abilities one-shot most builds. It doesn't reward anything besides prestige. There's no reason to farm or risk it unless you're seeking that sweet, sweet prestige. There is one more piece of bossing that D4 has over Path of Exile: world bosses. As Diablo is an open world game, it assuredly needed to contain some huge monsters to down in that vast space. Currently, it has 3. These creatures are imbued with massive power, but like world bosses in many other MMOs, they're simply loot pinatas on every single tier of difficulty. They look phenomenal, yes, but they're easy, don't drop engaging loot, and are even difficult to track, spawning at odd times many hours out from the next world boss. Now, we're finished. Let's tackle Path of Exile's bosses and bossing system. This game has way more bosses and far more reasons to fight them compared to Diablo 4. Plain and simple, the latter is the more important part. A caveat, of course, is Path of Exile's existence. It has been out way longer than D4. Regardless, there are 2 simple wins Blizzard could have pushed for here: a single set of bosses unique to endgame, and a reason to actually slay and chase those bosses. Let's really dig into how Path of Exile does it. Each of Path of Exile 1's 10 acts concludes with a unique act boss, with a bit of repetition in Act 5 and Act 10 fights with various Katava forms. Afterward, you hit Path of Exile's endgame, primarily focused around the Atlas of Worlds, which I discussed in a previous D4 and PoE comparison video. In the Atlas, you steadily progress battling map bosses, which are reskins of campaign act and area bosses, albeit sometimes with different abilities and plenty of unique modifiers. Then, you'll hit the current set of endgame story bosses: the Infinite Hunger, who guards the way to the Eater of Worlds, and the Black Star, who guards the path to the Searing Exarch. As you sweep through maps in the Atlas to reach those 4 Eldritch Horrors for the first time, you'll also encounter the Maven, an ally who loves to watch you fight and, eventually, beckons you to take a stab at her in her own arena. Plus, she also allows you to collect and fight bosses in that arena, stacking up to 10 map bosses and a variety of other special invitations involving bosses we're about to discuss. All of these can be imbued with various modifiers. Once you hit the highest range of maps, red maps, tiers 14 to 16, you'll begin finding Elder, Shaper, and Conqueror Guardian maps. These areas are influenced by powerful past endgame entities and their protectors. Killing these Guardians, of which each are unique endgame bosses, rewards you with portal fragments that eventually allow access to yet another set of historic pinnacle bosses. The Shaper, PoE's first truly iconic endgame boss, the Elder, the Shaper's counterpart, and Cirrus, the Awakener of Worlds, one of the most rage-inducing, Reddit thread-spawning fights in Path of Exile. But that's not all. On top of this, you can use PoE's Atlas passive skill tree to fight Uber versions of most of these pinnacle bosses. While the Uber versions don't gain brand new abilities, their fights are changed in meaningful ways. A single projectile spell might now shoot multiple projectiles. A certain crutch in a difficult phase might now be gone. An ad might spawn when it didn't before. They all become much harder fights. Plus, using the Maven, you can capture most of these pinnacle bosses too, and fight them all at once in her arena. There is a particular invitation called the Feared that allows you to fight a set of truly formidable bosses for a tremendous reward. I won't deeply explore any of the extra content systems beyond the Atlas and all their associated bosses, the trio of compelling battles in the Azurite Mine of Delve, Queen Etziri, the first pinnacle boss added to PoE, the Beyond Demon bosses, or any of the numerous others. For now, we'll simply stick to the Atlas of Worlds. Even just with that system, there's a ton of progression. You move from one boss to the next, each of them unique and not encountered before in the normal campaign. Additionally, this progression path is mostly up to you. Once you fight the core Eldritch bosses, you can sprawl out and pursue any of the others at your own leisure. Plus, these extremely challenging encounters can reward you with powerful items that only drop from them, or when you beat some of them for the first time, they allow you to expand your Atlas passive skill tree or shape your Atlas further by allowing you to favorite certain map designs you enjoy. It's a beautiful system that's taken years to iterate on, but it's been freely available to study for many, many years. So what's the disconnect here? Where are the differences? Truly, it appears to be two big things. The first is a clashing ideology between the Blizzard developers and the ARPG player base trying their game. The second is the increasingly obvious sped-up development and premature release of Diablo 4. Beginning with the former idea, Blizzard really wanted to build a Diablo MMO, somewhat mixed with ARPG elements. That's what it seems to be. World bosses are cool and all, but aren't great in an ARPG wherein they die almost instantly and provide nothing of real value. Pinnacle bosses are awesome, but if they don't have any real cost or reward associated with them, what's the point besides prestige? I've watched dozens of streamers attempt Uber Lilith hundreds of times. There's no limit, only a barrier of level 100 to enter her encounter. You can slam your head against this Daughter of Hatred wall over and over for the prestige, which I guess is cool, but there's nothing else to it. GGG, on the other hand, sought to craft the best ARPG possible. It's what their developers know. With bossing, there's a steady balance of risk. You get 6 portals for most boss fights. If you fail the fight, you need to gather the materials required to attempt it again. However, there's a real initial reward, Atlas passive skill points, and the potential for more on the first and subsequent runs in the form of spicy items only available from the specific boss being battled. Some of the absolute best and most build-enabling items drop from Path of Exile's pinnacle bosses. It's always a thrill to down them and potentially grab one of these. Of course, in PoE, if you're playing on Trade League, you can buy and sell these items too. So there's always the potential for a huge payoff even if you don't need the super rare item that drops for your own build. Then there's the boss design. Here's where I might get a little bit controversial. Diablo 4's boss design is bland, especially at endgame. The Nightmare dungeon bosses do almost nothing. The Pinnacle bosses are boring for the most part. It's only Uber Lilith that is designed somewhat well, and even then, her fight is constructed around one-shot mechanics purely and slightly wonky hitboxes. You cannot skill it, of course, but any minor mistake made will usually lead to death and a restart of the fight from the very beginning. While Path of Exile's map bosses are comparable to Nightmare dungeon bosses, they're far more varied and can be enhanced by wild modifiers and unforeseen situations that revamp the encounter. Path of Exile's Pinnacle bosses, on the other hand, are designed very well. One-shot mechanics are well telegraphed, either audibly or visually. See the Maven's Memory Game, Cirrus's Die Beam, or the Shaper's Slam. Players have a lot of control over how their fight goes with area control mechanics as well. Bosses have varied abilities that inflict conditions, deal tiny bits of damage in many increments, change the arena, or force the player to outplay or outwit them. Plus, with a wild enough character, even one-shots can be tanked in Path of Exile. None of this outline design is really present in Diablo 4 as it currently stands. I will note, as an aside, in both games, characters can become powerful enough to trivialize all boss mechanics, killing these Pinnacle foes in mere seconds. It's a reality of this genre, but it's not something I'm inspecting presently. This discussion is for folks battling against these bosses for the first time ever, in a league with a new character, or with an in-progress build not at its full power level. Okay, let's finally move on to the next difference. The second idea here is the lack of depth to Diablo 4's bossing. It's evident in numerous areas. I'm a fan of asset reuse. I praise grinding your games for it all the time. However, the only real challenging Pinnacle fight in the game of Diablo 4 is a bigger number Lilith. At the least, there should be one more layer atop Diablo 4's launch endgame, a set of 2 or 3 bosses leading into a truly unique Pinnacle encounter. In somewhat of opposition to this, if Blizzard wants to reuse assets for their endgame encounters, why not build out the boss progression and use some of the best boss fights in the game as Pinnacle encounters? Astaroth, the Act 2 boss, is only fought at the end of Act 2, and Dariel, the Act 4 boss, is only battled at the end of Act 4. Duriel is randomly encountered in the final act and never seen again. What is going on here? If you're going to reuse assets, go all out and build a sprawling initial endgame, asset reuse and all. The answer is time. Every passing day, it seems like Diablo 4 was released well before it was ready to go. When Diablo 3 or Path of Exile came out in the distant past, they didn't have any real competition. Rather, their competition didn't have numerous chunks of cool content and systems to compete with. That's not the case with Diablo 4. They had a baseline set by Path of Exile they should have tried to meet. My bar for Blizzard was the initial story bosses, some reused Pinnacle bosses, and a single set of endgame only foes to surmount. Instead, they decided to launch the game with the bare minimum, and even that is crashing down as the developers try to remedy it. This is a decision likely out of their hands, and I feel for them. Don't be upset at the developers, just voice frustrations about Diablo 4 itself, which, right now, is a half-baked game. Perhaps, eventually, it will gain more content and more reasons to slay bosses and achieve the excellent. For now, though, your best bet is to hop over to Path of Exile, try it out for free, and make the push to this amazing set of Pinnacle bosses. You won't regret it, and when you do reach these bosses, when you reach maps, your soul is forfeit, and you won't be returning to Diablo 4 anytime soon. Hey, you fellow exile or soon to be exiled individual, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and if you would appreciate seeing more content like it, subscribe now. You see all these exiles on screen, beached, totally sane, and unhinged. They help the channel grow with their direct support. If you would like to increase the quality and cadence of this content, Join my Patreon or become a channel member now for as little as $1 per month. Additionally, check out these juicy videos on your screen. To everyone who watched until this ultimate moment, Tala Moana.